In the 1920s, Alfred Korzybsky put together a contraption as a physical model to explain the different levels of abstraction. For his book, Science and Sanity, Korzybsky used a diagram based on that contraption. What follows is my interpretation of Korzybsky's diagram. Imagine that this undefined green shape represents the world as it is. Notice that the undefined shape extends beyond what is being shown here, implying that we are seeing a minuscule part of what is actually there. This is meant to suggest that human beings are finite creatures, limited in time and space, and so we are not equipped to experience the entire world. We can only experience the events in our immediate surrounding. The part of the shape that is being shown in the diagram represents a particular event that is happening or has just happened in our environment. That event is presumed to be the external cause of what we are experiencing or have just experienced. The event taking place in our environment is not one thing. It is made up of innumerable teeny tiny events at the submicroscopic level, that of molecules, atoms, electrons, protons, quarks, etc. These teeny tiny events are represented by the countless holes in the undefined shape. We cannot sense all of these submicroscopic events, but we are able to sense some of them. The information coming from the submicroscopic events that our sense organs can detect are represented by the strings hanging out of some of these holes. The holes without any strings represent all those teeny tiny events that our sense organs cannot detect. An example would be all the electromagnetic radiation whose wavelength is outside the visible spectrum. Below, there is a blue disk. Some of the strings coming out of the undefined shape pass through the holes in the disk, while most do not. The strings that do connect to the disk represent those aspects of the incoming sense data that are selected by our nervous system for further processing. Since the nervous system is not capable of dealing with every single piece of information, some loss of data is inevitable at this point. The raw information is then processed and converted into what we perceive as shapes, sounds, colors, motion, texture, etc. In this way, the blue disk represents our pre-verbal perception of whatever is happening or has just happened in our immediate environment. Next, there is an orange rectangle shaped like a label for clothing. It represents the process of naming. That's where language enters the picture, as the mind connects the object of its perception to a particular word or phrase. The experience can now be communicated in the form of sentences. After the orange rectangle, there's a yellow square, which looks like a post-it note. The relational property of symbolic language ensures that our mind will not stop at merely labeling the perceived object. It will generate thoughts in order to make the experience meaningful. This happens both through logical and arbitrary connections. The resulting inferences then become the context for all future experiences. What comes after the yellow square? Another yellow square, and then another, and then another. It's yellow squares all the way down. That's because the mind can generate thoughts about thoughts, ideas about ideas, judgments about judgments, and this can go on indefinitely. Let's take another look at the diagram. The first level, represented by the green shape, is called event. It's what happens, the thing in itself, reality as such, which is too big and too complex for us to fully grasp. The second level is called object. We perceive whatever our nervous system has constructed by processing the selected sense data. The critical point to remember is that the object of our perception is not identical with the event itself. What we perceive is not what's out there. There's a clear loss of information between what happens and what we perceive. The perceived object is an abstraction. Level 3 is called description. We recognize whatever is happening around us, which is another way of saying that our mind puts a label on what it has perceived. We can now describe our experience to ourselves and to others by using words. Now, the verbal description comes with its own baggage of conceptions, connotations, and associations, which is to say that, strictly speaking, our description is not entirely free from interpretation. However, for all practical purposes, we can ignore that limitation since it is built into our language. Let's assume that the description sticks as close to the observed facts as humanly possible, and that we are describing exactly what we are observing, nothing less and nothing more. The resulting description is objective in the sense that it agrees with what any other neutral observer would say. Yet, there is an obvious loss of information between our perception and our description. The critical point to remember is that the verbal description of what we have perceived is not identical with the object of our perception. The description is an abstraction. Level 4 is called inference. That's where we consciously or semi-consciously analyze our experience as abstracted through our verbal description to figure out what it means. At this level, our mind generates all sorts of thoughts, ideas, judgments, comparisons, memories, conclusions, etc. These will instantly coalesce to form a story, which is going to be some combination of objective reasoning and subjective biases. The critical point to remember is that the story that emerges at level 4 and then at all subsequent levels is the product of our mind's capacity for making connections. The inferences we draw at level 4 and beyond are not identical with the facts as described at level 3. So, here's the bottom line. What we infer is not the same thing as the factual description of what we observe, just as what we observe is not the same thing as what we perceive, and what we perceive is not the same thing as what really happens.